Right. Again, Nigel, thank you, and thank you for coming. So I'm going to try and talk about innovation policy here, and those are all my contacts. So let's start with an organising framework. So we've got some way or other kind of a lens through which to view all of this. Now, the Green Paper, that is to say the Industrial Strategy Consultation, which Nigel has been very assiduous about replying to, is essentially about economic growth. So you might ask the question, what's the background framework which the government have in mind to understand growth? And here I think if you're a consumer of the Green Paper, it's kind of important to understand what a hard-pressed Treasury official sort of thinks about it and how they organise their mind around all of this, because in the end, those hard-pressed Treasury officials are going to be the ones who may or may not give you the money. So how does a Treasury official think about it? They think about growth as meaning more output. Where does that come from? Well, it could either come from investing in more inputs, or it can come from using those inputs better. Now, what are the inputs? So the inputs are up on the screen there for you. Things like human capital, physical, tangible capital, intangible capital. So what are those? Let's do physical capital first, but that's possibly the most accessible. Machines, buildings, vehicles, you know, where we are very much here today. And intangible capital, again, being at the Warwick Manufacturing Centre, lots of R&D and the design and all those intangible things which are going on here as well. And then human capital is a way that economists describe the kind of the education and so forth which is embodied within us. Now, you might think that it's sort of deeply insulting to reduce humans to a sort of piece of machine, but hey, we're economists, so you know that's a sort of way in which we deal with these things. What drives these investing in more inputs? Things like prices, taxes, for example, computer prices, borrowing, R&D tax credits. They'll be very important to a lot of people in the audience. And the background economic environment, regulation, Brexit, things like that. If there's people are insecure about the future and feeling worried about our prospects, such as around Brexit, for example, then there might be less investment in these inputs. And what drives using them better? Things like competition, and then the reallocation from, for example, declining to growing sectors. So all of these things are the ways that, as I say, a sort of a hard-pressed Treasury official thinks about the items which are in the industrial strategy type of green paper. Now, in order to, I think, have a bit of background, I put a little slide together entitled the UK Productivity Puzzle. So this is a sort of slightly busy slide, but let me just walk you through all of this because I think it's worth understanding what the UK Productivity Puzzle is exactly and why it's a puzzle. So what this shows is the following. It shows outputs and inputs in the UK market sector, the source of the Office of National Statistics. Here is trend output per hour, since 1985. And if you draw this blue line here, this is a log scale. So those of you who remember your high school algebra will know that this tells you something about growth. If you draw this blue line, you can see that up to 2008, output per hour was growing bang on trend. The trend line, if we then continue, you can see that it's been growing way below trend. Okay, so that's the productivity puzzle, or part of the productivity puzzle. That is to say, relative to the trend increase in output per hour that we would expect, the British economy seems to be a long, long way off course. Now, you might say, well, that's not a big surprise. In 2008, we had an absolutely gigantic economic shock. Maybe firms are investing much less. It turned out that the banking system that we thought was absolutely fantastic turned out to be completely rubbish, and all those bankers were totally useless. They're not lending properly to firms and all that kind of thing. So you might say this fall in output per person is not a big surprise because maybe firms are investing less, and so the workers have got less capital with which to work. So the second line tells you the answer to that. Here's the trend increase in capital per person, again starting in 85 up to 2008. And you can see that before the Great Recession, actually, the pace of capital investment was falling slightly. And you can see that capital investment has indeed fallen. But if you look hard enough at this graph, you can see that the fall in capital investment is much less than this fall here in output. That is to say, it is true that workers have got less capital to work with because firms have been investing in this, but the output the fall in the output greatly exceeds this fall in the amount of capital. Okay, that's a productivity puzzle. And lastly, on skills, and you can see skills have just been growing very much on trend, if anything above trend, actually. So that just deepens the productivity puzzle. So again, what do we have? A big fall in output per hour, a bit of a fall, but a small fall in capital per hour, and firms are upskilling. So at the same time as firms have got a huge fall in their output power, they're taking on more and more skilled workers. And so that's what the productivity puzzle is as background to the industrial strategy. Now you might say, why are we worse therefore at using all these inputs? That is to say, we've got this increase in the inputs, labour capital, we seem to be getting not so much out of them, why are we worse? So let's just run through a few reasons, and again we can think about Brexit and strategy in that lens. The first is a sort of measurement reason. Now I'm on the board of the UK Statistics Authority, and we spend loads and loads of time worrying about whether GDP is measured correctly. So are we measuring Airbnb? Are we measuring Uber? Are we measuring robots? Also all sorts of robots in this room. Lots of stuff is all now held on the cloud. How do we measure that? You know, if you hold your data on the cloud, you don't even know where the cloud is located. So what does that mean in terms of imports and exports when we don't know the country to where, you know, you are obtaining your computer services, all those kind of complications. That's one possibility. The other possibility of what are broadly known as composition effects. Maybe banks, as I mentioned before, don't allocate their capital very well, and so maybe that's the source of the problem. Maybe there are these very low interest rates, and so there are a lot of firms who are keeping going, even though under ordinary circumstances they would go out of business. And then finally, you might say that the structure of the economy is changing. And here I want to put up a graph which has been produced by the researchers at the OECD, because I think it's pretty instructive. And you can see it here under the heading, the gap between the most productive firms and the rest is growing. So what does this do? This takes manufacturing, this takes services, this traces output per hour. This blue line I'm pointing to now is output per hour in the frontier firms. So this is accounting data for all European firms, more or less. And the frontier firms are growing very strongly. The laggards are lagging behind. Likewise in services, the frontier firms are growing very strongly and the laggards are lagging behind. So maybe what's going on is that there's just been a big change in the structure of the economy. And many of you who are sitting here thinking to yourselves, just a moment, I recognize that earlier graph in terms of capital investment. My company is making lots of capital investment. We're upskilling and all that kind of thing. You may say, I recognize that. But you might say, I simply don't recognize, let's go back to it, I simply don't recognize this big fall in output per hour. Well, it could be that you are one of these frontier firms here, and it seems like the frontier firms seem to be doing very well, and they're pulling away from the laggard firms. And so obviously a big question for Brexit industrial policy and all that kind of thing, if that's true, is what are the implications of all of that? All right, 2 more slides then, and then I'll stop. So the industrial policy, the government's green paper, here's a slide just saying what's in it. Well, what's in it are 10 pillars. So if you've read the document, it's arranged in sort of 10 chapters. And you can see the pillars up there. I won't read them all out, but they're things like investing in science and research and innovation, skills, infrastructure, supporting businesses to start and grow, procurement, and then you can read these other things, creating the institutions to bring together sectors and places. There's a lot of emphasis about regional disparities in productivity performance there. And then there are a few commitments, spending more on R&D, capital funding for institutes of technology, which are going to be training type of institutes, and then some stuff about infrastructure investment. Those commitments essentially repeat the commitments that were made in the autumn statement. So I don't think there's any new money there, but they do repeat those. And then there's something called sector deals, whereby in the green paper it encourages sectors to come to the government with a plan to show that the sector, the aerospace sector, the automotive sector, whatever it might be, the energy sector, whatever it might be, those sectors are being encouraged to come to the government with a plan and say, here's how we can get out of these productivity types of problems. Please will you support us with money for science and all that kind of thing. So those are the sort of features of it. Okay, so let me make a few slides. So again, in case you've forgotten them, there are the features on the right-hand side of the board. So I've put up the heading here, what's not to like. Okay? All of these things on the right-hand side of the board seem to be all perfectly sensible. Investing in skills, more growth across the whole economy. How could you possibly disagree with all of that? So let me make a few points. And like everybody else in this room, I've learnt from Professor Nick Crafts, who's sitting up in the back here, who has a very nice piece which goes into this in a lot more detail. Now, the way that Nick has very influentially described industrial policy is to think about it in the following way. You can think about horizontal policy and vertical policy. Horizontal policy affects all the sectors So science, skills, infrastructure, you'd think that would be good for lots of different sectors. If lots more skilled workers coming along, that would affect retailing, that would affect aerospace, that would affect everybody. So I've put a tick next to that. Economists like that. Here's the next thing, vertical policy. We were talking earlier on, Matthew and I, just about the 1970s. Vertical policy favours some particular sectors, maybe even some particular firms, the British Leylands, the British Steel and people like that. And I put a cross next to that. Generally speaking, economists are much more suspicious about those types of policies, and the legacy of the 1970s will give you a clue as to why. So, some possible gaps. So let me, before I say that, is just to finish the point, and again, Nick Crafts has made this point much more eloquently than me. Things like these first four headings are broadly speaking vertical, other way around, are broadly speaking horizontal policies, skills, infrastructure, and all that kind of thing. Big tick next to that from many economists. Things like a sector deal, for example, seems to be much more of a vertical kind of policy, and economists are a little bit more suspicious about that, unless because they're worried that governments might be captured by particular sectors and the money may not be well spent. It may be well spent, but we have some hard experience in the past which tells us that there may be an issue here. A few more gaps. Will the policy help the laggards catch up? What about business dynamism? There's not that much discussion about entrepreneurialism and new firms and all that kind of thing. And again, if the problem is that some firms are pulling away from other firms, that would be an issue. Finance, there's remarkably little about whether the banking system is fit for purpose. We've had this extraordinary shock to the banking system. Maybe the types of new companies, which, again, talking to Matthew earlier on, which new startups, heavy on intangible assets, maybe the banking system is not well suited to those types of companies. There's very little about taxes and regulation, land use, so some of the land use issues around planning are well aired. Things around taxes, capital is extremely mobile, it's very sensitive, therefore, to comparative tax rates between different countries. Is there enough of a response on Brexit? So there's an issue about R&D tax credits. There's going to be a review of R&D tax credits. Again, I suspect a number of people in this room might be an important source of finance, an important tax break for people, for many firms in this room. So to the extent that that's true, if that goes away, that may be a problem. There's not much about the rebuilding of the supply chains. The Treasury document on Brexit talked very eloquently about this type of supply chains like Airbus, very integrated supply chains where goods are exported to a country, come back again, re-exported and all that kind of thing. Not much about that. There's a lot of uncertainty around the status of the service sector. And so here, if I put my statistics hat on, we're not sure, actually, how much service sector trade we do with Germany. We think we have a surplus. If you go to the German balance of payments data, they think they have a surplus. Both those things cannot be true. So dealing with that issue is an important issue. And then lastly, about state aid and favouring certain sectors after Brexit. Part of what being in the EU is about is sort of stopping state aid and possibly stopping some of the worst excesses of this vertical policy. And so there's an issue about that. And then finally, all the answers are, of course, in our new book called Capitalism Without Capital, which tells you everything that you need to know about all of this. So at that point, Nigel, I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you.